My name is Serena Vale. I am 29 years old and I am 6 months pregnant. When my father died, he left me a legacy that could change the course of my life forever. He left me ValeTech, the company he built with his own hands, the empire that carried his name. But he also left behind a condition, one that turned joy into fear, inheritance into a battlefield. I could only become the true head of ValeTech when I became a mother. Only when my child was born, when I held that life in my arms, would the 70% of the company that belonged to me truly come under my control. Until then, I was powerless. I still hear his words echo in my memory. He used to say only a parent understands responsibility, that only when you protect a life more fragile than your own do you know how to lead with strength and compassion. Perhaps he was right, but in his effort to protect me, he made me vulnerable. He gave others a reason to see my unborn child not as family, but as a key. The day of his funeral is carved into my soul. The sky was gray, heavy with silence. The halls of the church smelled of lilies and sorrow. People whispered about Richard Vale, the brilliant mind behind ValeTech, the man who created jobs for thousands, the man who changed the future of cybersecurity. But no one spoke about what he left behind for me. No one knew the storm that was coming. I stood there, one hand on my stomach, the other clutching the folded will. My heart was breaking, and yet, fear was already crawling into my chest. I was grieving my father, but at the same time, I was preparing for a fight I never asked for. In the days that followed, I tried to focus on my health. I tried to imagine a peaceful pregnancy, to believe that life could still be gentle, even without my father. But reality was harsher than any nightmare, because while I waited, while I carried his grandchild, the company was not mine to hold. By the words of the will, ValeTech was placed in temporary hands. Those hands belonged to Vivienne, my stepmother. Vivienne was younger than my father by almost 20 years, beautiful, poised, and sharp. Too sharp. To the world, she looked like the grieving widow, carrying his legacy with dignity. But to me, her smile felt rehearsed. Her eyes never softened. She was given the authority to guide ValeTech until my child was born. And that power, even if temporary, was enough to make her dangerous. And then there was Ethan, my husband, the man I once believed was my partner in everything. He was not just my husband, he was the chief financial officer of ValeTech. He controlled the money, the contracts, the flow of power that pulsed through the company. He was supposed to be my shield, the person who would protect both me and the empire my father entrusted to us. But as the weeks went by, I felt the distance grow. Ethan became restless, distracted. His phone lit up at midnight. His excuses piled higher than I could believe. He looked at me not as his wife carrying our child, but as an obstacle in his way. And still, I told myself it was the grief. I told myself we were all broken, that maybe time would heal us. I clung to that hope because I wanted to believe in him, because I needed to. But deep down, beneath the layers of denial, a small voice whispered, something was terribly wrong. I could not escape the weight of my father's decision. His empire sat in my hands, and yet it slipped like sand through my fingers, until the day my child was born. Every morning I touched my stomach, whispering promises that I would protect them, promises that I would fight for them. But I did not know then that those closest to me were already plotting, that the very condition my father believed would keep me strong was the same condition that would put my baby and me in deadly danger. The weeks after my father's funeral were heavy, darker than I ever imagined. I was grieving, exhausted, and 6 months pregnant. My body felt weaker with each passing day. I wanted to rest, to hide away from the world, but ValeTech would not wait. I forced myself to get dressed, to step into the building that carried my father's name, and to show that I could still stand, even when everything inside me was breaking. I sat through meetings with my hand on my stomach, praying no one could see how unsteady I felt. I told myself I needed to stay visible, that I had to prove I was ready to inherit the weight of ValeTech. But every moment inside that boardroom reminded me just how fragile my position really was. And Ethan, the man who once promised to be my anchor, was slipping further away. He was always busy, always buried in financial reports. Long hours at the office, long nights at his desk. He told me he was trying to keep things stable, that as chief financial officer he carried the burden of my father's absence. But his words felt thinner. With every excuse, I would wait for him at home, watching the clock, telling myself he was simply working too hard. That grief had hardened him, that he was protecting me by taking on more than his share. But deep inside, loneliness was gnawing at me. I was carrying his child, Sayan, and yet I felt abandoned. When he did come home, his eyes were distant. His phone never left his hand. Sometimes it lit up late at night, and when I asked who it was, he shrugged. "Just business," he said. But the way he turned the screen away from me, the way his tone sharpened when I pressed too hard, it left me with an ache I could not name. And then there was Vivienne. She moved through ValeTech like she owned the air in every room. To the world, she was the grieving widow, dressed in black, speaking softly, pretending to carry my father's memory with grace. But when she looked at me, I felt something colder, something sharp, like she was measuring how long I could last. What unsettled me most was how often she and Ethan were together. They scheduled private strategy meetings, never including me. They whispered at the far end of the conference table, their voices dropping the moment I stepped inside. Once, I walked into a boardroom earlier than expected, and they both stopped mid-sentence. Their eyes darted to mine, guilty, but polished enough to hide behind a smile. "Just financial updates," Ethan told me. "Company matters, dear," Vivienne added. But the weight in my chest told me otherwise. I noticed small things first. A laugh shared too easily, a glance held just a little too long. Then I noticed larger things, the way Vivienne praised Ethan during meetings, calling him indispensable, stressing how much the company relied on him now. She went out of her way to highlight his devotion, his competence, his brilliance. It was too much, too rehearsed, too deliberate. And then came the numbers. Whispers reached me from employees who had once been loyal to my father. They were nervous, hesitant, but they trusted me enough to speak. They told me about contracts that looked suspicious, payments to companies no one had heard of, firms with no offices, no employees, just names on paper. Yet somehow, they were receiving large transfers from ValeTech. I asked to see the documents myself, and when I did, my blood ran cold. Every single transaction, every questionable deal bore Ethan's signature, my husband, my chief financial officer. I stared at the pages until the numbers blurred. I told myself there had to be an explanation, a mistake in the system, a missing piece that would make it make sense. But deep down, I knew Ethan was not just drifting away from me as a husband. He was pulling away as a partner in the company. He was making decisions without me, decisions that drained money, that left shadows where there should have been light. I wanted to confront him, to demand the truth. But fear stopped me. Fear that if I pushed too soon, I would lose the thin thread holding us together. Fear that if I accused him and I was wrong, I would look paranoid, unstable, exactly what Vivienne wanted the board to believe about me. So I stayed silent. I swallowed the dread. I carried it with me through sleepless nights and quiet mornings. whispering to my unborn child that everything would be all right. But each time I walked into ValeTech, each time I saw Ethan at Vivienne's side, my hope cracked a little more. I told myself they were simply working to protect my father's legacy. I told myself they were united in grief, in duty. But in my heart, I felt the truth pressing closer. Something was shifting, something dangerous. And one night, I would finally see it with my own eyes. It was late. Later than it should have been. Ethan had not come home again. I sat alone in the quiet house, my hands resting on my stomach, trying to calm the child inside me. But unease would not leave me. Something felt wrong, so wrong that I could not sit still any longer. I told myself I would just go to ValeTech, check on a few documents, maybe even surprise him. But deep down, I already knew what I was looking for. The building was silent when I arrived. The hallways were dim, the lights humming faintly. My heels echoed against the polished floor, each step heavier than the last. And then I heard it. A laugh. Low, soft, familiar. It came from behind the door of Vivienne's office. My chest tightened as I moved closer. Every breath felt sharp. My heart was pounding so loud that I wondered if they could hear it on the other side of the wall. I pushed the door open, and there they were. Ethan, my husband, Vivienne, my stepmother, standing too close. Their bodies angled toward each other, eyes locked in a way that spoke louder than words ever could. For a moment, they froze, like guilty children caught in the act. But then, Ethan straightened, his expression turning cold. Vivienne smoothed her dress, a faint smile curling on her lips. I felt my knees weaken, my throat burned, the air in the room grew too heavy to breathe. How long? The words slipped out before I could stop them. How long have you been betraying me? Ethan's eyes met mine, and for the first time, he did not pretend. He did not lie. Long enough, he said. His voice was steady, almost proud. I stared at him, waiting for some sign of regret. But there was none. He went on, his tone sharp, cutting through me like glass. Whatever you thought we had, Serena, it died a long time ago. Vivienne is the one who understands me. She is the one who belongs at my side. Vivienne said nothing. She only watched me, her lips curved in that same rehearsed smile. The one I had always feared. I wanted to scream, to collapse, to run, but I forced myself to stand still, even as my hands trembled against the swell of my belly. You are not only betraying me, I whispered. You are betraying my father, his company, his legacy. Ethan laughed under his breath. Your father? He is gone, Serena, and what he left behind belongs to those strong enough to hold it. His words sliced through me, cruel and final. But he was not finished. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over me. His voice dropped lower, colder. You only hold power if that child survives, he said. You are nothing without it. I am the chief financial officer. Vivienne is the acting head. If you lose the baby, ValeTech will belong to us. The room spun. My hands clutched at my stomach instinctively, protecting the life inside me from the venom in his words. I searched his face for a trace of humanity, but there was none. Only ambition. Only cruelty. Vivienne finally spoke. Her voice was smooth, mocking in its calmness. You should be careful, dear. Stress is not good for the baby. I felt the walls closing in around me. My father's office, the company he had built, the empire I was meant to inherit. And here they stood, conspiring to steal it all. It was not just an affair, not just a betrayal of love. It was treason against my family, against the very blood that built ValeTech. My chest ached, my eyes burned with tears I refused to shed in front of them. I realized then that Ethan was not simply a husband who had strayed. He was an enemy, A man who had chosen power over loyalty, greed over love. I backed away slowly, my heart racing, my breath shallow. Neither of them stopped me. They just watched, confident, as if they had already won. I stumbled into the hallway, the door slamming shut behind me. Every step away from that office felt heavier. Every thought screamed inside my head. The man I had trusted with my life, the man I was carrying a child for, was plotting with my stepmother. They wanted the company, they wanted my inheritance, and now they wanted my baby. I pressed my hands over my stomach, whispering to the child inside me, whispering promises through the tears that finally fell. I will protect you. I swear it. I will not let them win. But as I stood there in the dark corridor of ValeTech, one truth settled deep in my bones. This was no longer just betrayal. It was war. After that night in Vivienne's office, I was never the same. Every word Ethan had spoken clung to me like a curse. You only hold power if that child survives. It repeated in my mind again and again until it poisoned my sleep, until it haunted me in every waking hour. I began to notice everything, the way Ethan looked at me, detached, almost impatient, as though he was waiting for something to happen. The way Vivienne's eyes followed me in silence, calculating, like she was studying a piece of fragile glassware, wondering when it might finally shatter. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that grief had made me paranoid, that the world was not as cruel as it suddenly seemed. But soon, the accidents began. The first was on the road. I was on my way to a routine checkup, the kind of appointment that should have been uneventful, but halfway there, the brakes gave out. The car lurched forward, unstoppable, the driver's face pale with panic. I clutched my belly, certain it was the end, but by some miracle, the emergency brake caught just before we struck the intersection. I was trembling, drenched in cold sweat. The mechanic later said the brake line had been loosened, deliberately. He said it could have been sabotage. My heart sank, but I bit my tongue. I wanted to scream, to accuse, but I had no proof, only fear. Days later, I nearly fell down the staircase in our home. The marble steps were slick with water, though the maid swore she had not cleaned them that morning. My foot slid, my balance faltered, and for one terrifying second, I felt the world tilt. I caught the railing just in time. If I had fallen, I might not be here to tell this story, and neither would my child. I stood there, frozen, my hand gripping the banister so hard my knuckles turned white. I could almost feel Ethan's words pressing into my skin. If you lose the baby, ValeTech will belong to us. Was this their doing? Or was fate itself conspiring against me? I wanted to believe it was coincidence, but I could no longer lie to myself. The final blow came one afternoon. I was in the study, exhausted after another restless night. Ethan appeared with a glass of juice, his expression calm, too calm. You need to keep your strength up, he said. His smile was gentle, practiced, as if he had rehearsed it in the mirror. I hesitated, but I was tired, and I wanted so desperately to believe he still cared. So I drank. Minutes later, pain ripped through me. My stomach twisted into knots, my vision blurred. The room swayed as if the floor had been pulled out from under me. I gasped for air, but my throat tightened, refusing to let breath pass. The glass slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor. I collapsed to my knees, clutching my stomach, praying the child inside was still safe. I tried to call out, but only a broken whisper escaped. The world around me dimmed. And then, by some miracle, Maria found me. Maria, the housekeeper who had been with my family since I was a little girl. She screamed my name, rushed to my side, and called for help. The next thing I remember was the harsh light of the hospital ceiling. Doctors moving quickly around me, voices sharp with urgency, machines beeping, the sound of my own heartbeat racing in my ears. Hours later, a doctor came to me. His eyes were serious, his voice steady. There was a sedative in your system, he said, a powerful one. Extremely dangerous for a woman in your condition. You are very lucky we acted quickly. The baby is safe, but you must be careful. Another episode like this could have devastating consequences. I lay there, tears sliding silently down my face. Safe. For now. Those words crushed me. Safe, but fragile. Alive, but threatened. I pressed my hand against my belly, feeling the faint movement beneath my palm. I whispered promises through the tears. I will protect you. I swear it. I will not let them take you from me. Lying in that hospital bed, I pieced it all together. The failed brakes, the wet stares, the poisoned drink. It was no longer possible to call it coincidence. Too many accidents, too many close calls. Someone wanted me to lose this child, and I already knew who. Ethan's warning had not been a slip of the tongue. It had been a plan, a declaration. He wanted me to fail. He wanted me to break. And Vivienne, she stood beside him, smiling, waiting for the moment my world would collapse. But as I lay there, the fear inside me began to change. It hardened into something else, something sharper. For the first time since my father's death, I felt the flame of defiance rise inside me. If they wanted a fight, they would have one. This was no longer just about ValeTech, no longer just about inheritance. This was survival, mine and my child's, and I swore, with every breath left in me, that I would not let them win. Lying in the hospital bed after the poisoning, I could barely breathe. Every sound was too loud, every shadow too close. But beneath the fear, something sharper began to take hold. I thought of my father. I thought of his strength, the way he always seemed to see further than anyone else. And then a memory returned. It was a quiet evening months before he died. He had called me into his study, his expression grave, his voice softer than usual. He handed me a small silver USB, plain, unremarkable, easy to overlook. If a day ever comes when you do not know who to trust, he said, trust me, trust this. At the time, I had not understood. I thought it was just his way of comforting me, of reminding me that he would always be with me. But now, as I lay trembling with the weight of what Ethan and Vivienne had done, I understood. He had known. When I returned home, I went straight to the hidden safe in my bedroom. My hands shook as I pulled out the tiny device. I had kept it all this time, unopened, untouched, too consumed by grief to even wonder what it might hold. Now I plugged it into my laptop. A password screen appeared. For a moment I panicked, but then I remembered. My father always used the same phrase when he wanted me to remember something. The child is the future. I typed it in. The screen unlocked, and what I found inside made my heart stop. It was not a letter, not a goodbye. It was data. Dozens of folders, each one labeled with dates and names, transaction logs, scanned contracts, records of payments to companies I had never heard of, companies with no offices, no employees, no purpose. But the money flowing into them was real, and every document bore signatures. Vivienne's name appeared in several, but worse, I saw Ethan's. Page after page carried his signature as Chief Financial Officer, approving transfers that bled ValeTech's accounts dry. I scrolled faster, my pulse racing, my breath shallow. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. My father had not been blind. He had seen something. He had suspected Vivienne, and perhaps even Ethan, and he had begun gathering evidence, quietly, methodically, until the day his heart gave out. Tears blurred my vision as I stared at the screen. It was all here, but it was not enough. Some documents were incomplete. Some were just scans without official seals. Others were only fragments, pieces of a larger puzzle, enough to point in the right direction, but not enough to win the war. I whispered into the empty room. You were trying to protect me, weren't you, Dad? He had left me a torch in the dark, but it was only a light to guide me, not the weapon itself. If I wanted to stop Ethan and Vivienne, I would have to carry the fight further than he ever could. The next day, I made an appointment with Harris, my father's longtime lawyer. He had known our family for decades. When I arrived at his office, I felt the weight of every step. I showed him the USB. I showed him the contracts, the payments, the shell companies. He studied them quietly, his brow furrowed, his eyes grave. When he looked up, his voice was steady but low. "Your father came to me once," he said. He told me he suspected Vivienne was moving money out of the company. He was trying to gather evidence. But then he died. I never saw what he had collected, until now. I asked him what I should do. I asked him how to stop them. He leaned forward, folding his hands. These documents are not enough on their own, but they are a starting point. They give us direction, names, accounts, dates. If you want to bring this to light, you must take it to the FBI. They are the only ones who can trace the money, connect the dots, and make a case strong enough to stand in court. The FBI. The words struck me like a bell. For the first time since my father's death, I felt a path forming before me, a path that did not end in silence, but in justice. When I left Harris's office, the USB was clutched tightly in my hand. It felt heavier than before, as though my father's presence lingered inside it. It was not just data. It was his voice, his warning, his final gift. I stepped out into the cold air, the wind brushing against my face, and for the first time in weeks, I did not feel completely alone. My father had seen this coming. He had left me the first piece of the puzzle, and now it was my turn to finish what he had started. I pressed the USB to my chest, whispering to myself, and to the child growing inside me. I am not afraid anymore. They think I am powerless, but they are wrong. This is not over. This is just the beginning. After the hospital, after the poison, I knew I could not go on living in fear. But I also knew I could not strike too soon. If I made one wrong move, Ethan and Vivienne would tighten their grip, and my child and I would not survive. So I chose to become what they expected me to be: weak, hopeless, defeated. I let my shoulders sag. I let my voice tremble. I stopped questioning them in meetings, stopped raising my eyes when they whispered at the other end of the table. I stayed home more often, claiming exhaustion, claiming the pregnancy was too much. And it worked. I saw it in Ethan's smirk when he walked past me. I saw it in Vivienne's eyes, sharp with triumph. They thought I was finished. They thought the battle was already won. But while they celebrated in secret, I began my own war. I started with the documents. Late at night, when Ethan was away, I crept into his study. I searched his drawers, his safe, the files he never thought I would touch. I found copies of contracts that matched the ones on my father's USB, payments to empty companies, invoices signed by Ethan himself. I copied everything. Page after page, I kept the originals safe in a box only I could reach. Next came the accounts. With Harris's help, I traced the transfers further. The trail led to offshore banks, names I had never heard, but accounts that matched the ghost companies on the contracts. Each one tied to signatures, each one bleeding ValeTech's wealth into shadows. But the most damning proof was not on paper. It was in Ethan's own words. One night, I left a small recorder hidden in the corner of Vivienne's office. My hands shook as I placed it there, terrified someone would catch me. But hours later, when I returned to retrieve it, the red light was still blinking. When I pressed play, my blood turned to ice. Ethan's voice filled the room, steady and cruel. Once she loses the baby, ValeTech is ours. I stopped breathing. I listened again and again, each word cutting deeper. It was no longer suspicion. It was confession. I sat in the dark, the recorder pressed to my chest, tears running down my face. I placed my hand over my belly, whispering to the child inside me, "They want to erase you, but I will not let them. Not while I am still breathing." The next morning, I went to Harris. I showed him everything: the contracts, the transfers, the recording. His face grew pale, his jaw tight. He leaned across the table, speaking in a low voice. "This is serious, Serena, but it is not enough to end them in court. You need more. You need federal investigators. Only the FBI can untangle money like this. Only they can trace the shell companies and the offshore accounts. The FBI. The thought alone made me tremble. To bring strangers into this secret, to trust outsiders with my father's empire, with my child's safety, it terrified me. But I knew he was right. I could not fight this war alone. So Harris arranged a meeting. It was late at night in a small office far from the city, a place with no signs, no names. 2 agents sat across from me, their eyes sharp, their notepads ready. I slid the USB across the table, then the contracts, the offshore data, and finally, the recording. They listened in silence. They took notes. When it ended, one of them looked at me, his expression unreadable. "This is a start," he said. "It gives us cause. But you must not let them know. If they suspect you are cooperating with us, they will accelerate their plans. You must act as though you know nothing. Keep collecting whatever you can. We will investigate the rest." I nodded, though my hands were trembling. For the first time since my father's death, I felt the weight shift. I was no longer just surviving. I was fighting back. That night, I returned home and sat alone in the nursery. The room was unfinished, the crib still in pieces, the walls bare. But as I sat there, listening to the faint hum of the house, I felt my strength return. I played the recording one last time. Ethan's voice filled the silence. "Once she loses the baby, ValeTech is ours." I placed my hand over my stomach. The baby moved just a little, like a reminder that life was still fighting inside me. And in that moment, my tears dried. I whispered into the darkness, "You will live, you will grow, and one day, you will inherit everything they tried to steal. I promise you." From then on, I was no longer their victim, no longer their pawn. I was my father's daughter, and I was ready to finish the war he could not. The morning of the board meeting felt heavy, like a storm pressing against the windows. I stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the fabric of my dress over my swollen belly. For a moment, I saw my father's eyes looking back at me, reminding me who I was. I whispered to myself, "Today is the day." When I entered the boardroom, every face turned. The long, polished table gleamed beneath the lights. The walls were lined with portraits of ValeTech's history, my father's legacy watching silently from every frame. Ethan sat at his place near the head of the table, his posture rigid, his suit immaculate. Vivienne stood beside him, draped in black silk, the perfect image of elegance and authority. Together, they looked untouchable. I sat quietly at the opposite end, my hands folded in my lap. I kept my expression calm, though my heart thundered beneath my ribs. The meeting began. Ethan rose to speak, his voice steady, carrying false concern. "Members of the board," he said, "we all admire Serena's strength during this difficult time. But the truth is clear. Her health is fragile. Her judgment is clouded. She cannot lead ValeTech in her current state." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. Vivienne stepped forward, her voice smooth as silk. "For the stability of this company, for the safety of its future, we must appoint leadership that is steady, capable, and strong." She looked directly at me, her smile faint and sharp. "I propose that Ethan and I continue to guide ValeTech, permanently." Murmurs rippled around the table. Some nodded. Others hesitated, but I could see the momentum shifting toward them. Ethan prepared to call for the vote. I held my breath. And then, the doors burst open. A rush of footsteps filled the room. Men and women in dark suits entered, their badges glinting beneath the lights. The room fell silent. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," one agent announced. His voice was firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. He stepped forward, holding up a document. "This is a warrant for the arrest of Ethan Vale and Vivienne Cross." The board erupted in gasps. Chairs scraped back, papers rustled, voices rose in shock. The agent's words continued, clear and deliberate. Ethan Vale, you are charged with federal financial fraud, international money laundering, and conspiracy to cause harm to a pregnant woman. Vivienne Cross, you are charged as an accomplice in fraud and obstruction of justice. I turned my head slowly, watching the color drain from Ethan's face. For the first time, his mask cracked. Vivienne staggered back a step, her hands trembling, her voice caught in her throat. This is a mistake, Ethan snapped, his voice breaking. He tried to rise, but the agents were already on him. They laid the documents on the table, the contracts, the offshore accounts, the recording. Evidence. Undeniable and damning. Vivienne shook her head, tears smudging her mascara. She whispered, No, this cannot be happening. But the cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. I rose slowly from my seat. Every eye in the room turned to me. For a moment, I let the silence stretch, the weight of everything pressing down. Then I spoke. My voice was calm, steady, colder than I had ever known it could be. Ethan, you did not just betray me. You betrayed this company. You betrayed my father's trust. You betrayed every single person who sits at this table. I felt the fire rise in my chest, but my words remained controlled. And now, justice will take everything back from you. Ethan's eyes burned with rage as they pulled him toward the door. But his power was gone. His empire of lies had collapsed in front of the very people he thought he could control. The room was still in shock as the agents led Ethan and Vivienne away. I stood at the head of the table, my hands resting gently on my stomach. The child inside me shifted, a small reminder that life still beat strongly within. For weeks, I had been silent. For weeks, I had pretended to be weak. But today, I stood in the light of my father's legacy. I looked at the board members, their eyes wide with awe, with disbelief, and I spoke once more, softly, but with certainty. They thought I was powerless. They thought I would break. But I am Richard Vale's daughter, and I will protect this company, just as I will protect my child. This is my fight now, and I will not lose. In that moment, I felt something shift deep inside me. I was no longer the woman hiding in the shadows of fear. I was no longer the victim of betrayal and lies. I was the heir of ValeTech, and the storm they tried to unleash against me had become the fire that would burn them down. Justice came slowly, but it came. The trial stretched on for weeks, each day peeling back the layers of deception that Ethan and Vivienne had built around ValeTech. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged contracts, the offshore accounts, the recording of Ethan's own voice, cold, cruel, confessing the plan to take everything from me. I sat in the courtroom, one hand resting on my stomach, listening as the verdict was read. Ethan Vale, guilty of federal fraud, guilty of money laundering, guilty of conspiracy to harm a pregnant woman. Vivienne Cross, guilty of complicity, guilty of hiding the crimes that nearly destroyed my family. The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder. The weight of months of fear lifted from my chest. They were led away in handcuffs, their heads bowed, their futures stolen by the very greed that had driven them. For the first time in so long, I could breathe. The months that followed were quieter, though not without pain. My pregnancy was fragile. Every day felt like a battle. But I fought with every breath, every ounce of strength I had left. And then, the day came. The hospital lights were blinding, the air thick with the sounds of urgency. I gripped the sheets, tears streaming down my face, praying my child would survive. And when I heard that first cry, raw, beautiful, alive, my heart broke open. I held my baby in my arms, trembling, whispering through my tears, "You made it. We made it." In that moment, I felt my father's presence. I felt the weight of his hand on my shoulder, the echo of his voice telling me I was stronger than I believed. When I left the hospital, my child in my arms, the world was no longer the same. The condition in my father's will had been met. The promise had been fulfilled. I was now the rightful CEO of ValeTech. The board could no longer question me. The law could no longer deny me. Every document, every share, every vote of power, it was mine. But more than that, the respect that I had fought so hard for was finally mine as well. I walked into the boardroom once again. The same room where they had tried to strip me of my father's legacy. Now, every face turned toward me, not with doubt, but with acknowledgement, with respect. I did not need to raise my voice. I simply held my child close, and I told them, "This company will survive. It will grow. It will honor the name Richard Vale." And in their silence, I knew they believed me. Weeks later, I stood outside ValeTech's tower. The glass facade shimmered in the morning light, rising like a monument to everything my father had built. I stood there holding my child, wrapped in a soft blanket, their tiny hand curled around my finger. The air was cool, the sun gentle, and for the first time in months, I felt peace. Cameras flashed from a distance. People whispered as they passed by, but I only looked up at the building, my eyes steady, my heart unshaken. I had been betrayed. I had been hunted. I had been pushed to the edge of despair, but I had survived, and now I was more than a survivor. I was a mother. I was the heir of ValeTech. I was the living proof that their schemes had failed. As I looked down at my child, sleeping against my chest, the final truth settled into me. They wanted to make motherhood my weakness, but it became my strength. They wanted my child gone, but it was because of this child that I found the courage to fight. They wanted to destroy my inheritance, but instead, they gave me the reason to protect it. Being a mother was never a burden. It was my greatest weapon, and it is the reason they lost everything. I lifted my head, my eyes fixed on the ValeTech tower, the legacy of my father, the promise of my future, and I whispered, steady and strong, "This is only the beginning."